Welcome back to another quiet journey into the past, where shadows stretched longer, nights felt deeper, and silence carried meaning. Tonight, we're stepping beyond the towering gates of stone and echoing corridors of power into a place that wasn't nearly as safe as it seemed, the medieval castle. But before we begin this slow descent into torchlit halls and creaking staircases, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep bringing you calm, thoughtful history exactly when you need it, especially when sleep feels far away. So now, lay back, close your eyes if you wish, and let your thoughts drift behind the heavy doors of stone. Because you wouldn't survive a night in a medieval castle, and here's why. Forget the fairy tale image of a quiet, moonlit castle with the noble family sleeping safely in their feather beds while the wind gently rattles the shutters. That version never really existed. In truth, medieval castles, especially at night, were places of constant motion, low-level tension, and uncomfortable unpredictability. If you found yourself spending a night inside one, you wouldn't be resting. You'd be enduring. From the moment the sun slipped behind the hills, a medieval castle transformed. The gates were bolted, yes, but the interior came alive in a different way, with torch changes, patrol rotations, and a heavy sense of watchfulness. Even in peacetime, a castle operated like a nervous body. The lord or lady of the keep might be asleep, but a rotating schedule of servants, guards, and attendants kept things moving at all hours. And if you were a guest or visitor, the first thing you'd feel was that you didn't belong to this rhythm. You didn't know when people would appear, which hallway was allowed, or what sound meant danger. It was like entering a machine you hadn't been trained to understand. Let's begin with the basic problem. The darkness. Medieval castles had no central lighting. Candles were expensive and saved for the important rooms or important people. Most of the halls and stone corridors remained in near total darkness after sunset. A few flickering torches might mark the way down main paths, but they cast more shadows than light. Your eyes would strain, your steps would echo, and if you didn't already know the layout, getting lost was easy and dangerous. It's recorded in several manor logs from 13th century England and France that visiting pages or guests had to be physically escorted to their sleeping quarters. Not out of politeness, but out of necessity. One wrong turn, and you could end up in a servant's wing, a food cellar, or worse, in a section guarded for military access. In one documented case from a Welsh border keep, a merchant's son was nearly killed after accidentally walking into the armory post room at night. He startled a sleepy watchman who thought he was an intruder. No one questioned the guard afterward. The boy had not been mindful of the quiet rules. But even if you found your assigned room, don't expect comfort, guest quarters especially. For anyone who wasn't nobility, were stark at best. A straw mattress laid over a wooden frame, a thin wool blanket, if you were lucky, and a heavy iron latch on the inside of the door. The latch wasn't there for privacy. It was there so you could hold it shut. Why? Because doors opened at night, on their own, or not. Sometimes it was the wind. Sometimes it wasn't. There's a recurring line in household records from the early 1300s. Sleep light and hear the latch. Meaning, if you hear the door shift, wake up. Guards patrolled the interior. Runners checked chambers. Messages were passed even at midnight. And unlike today, where you'd knock or call out, the expectation was to enter first, explain later. So, if you were sleeping in a room meant for storage, transit, or backup lodging, you might have a soldier step over your mattress without a word. Now consider the soundscape. Castles were made of stone. They creaked. They echoed. Water dripped. Wood popped from temperature changes. Animals in the stables shifted and grunted. Birds stirred in rafters. Add in the footsteps of guards on rotation, the grinding pull of chains at the gatehouse, and the ever-present sound of wind slipping through narrow slits of window. And what you have is not silence, but a kind of low, humming alertness. The Castle was always half awake. Sleep wasn't just difficult. It was strange. Even noble residents wrote about this. Letters from the Countess of Artois in the mid-1200s complain about the cold breath of the east wall and the calls made down the narrow stair. These weren't ghost stories. These were the realities of massive, poorly insulated structures filled with strangers, iron, and fear. And let's not forget the plumbing, or rather, the lack of it if nature called in the middle of the night. Your options were limited. If you were lucky, your room had a chamber pot. If not, you were expected to find your way to a garderobe, the castle's version of a latrine. These were built into the outer walls, usually down a narrow, freezing corridor with no light. More than one guest is known to have gotten lost or injured trying to relieve themselves in the dark, and the smell? It never fully left the walls. Even castle bedrooms often carried the faint scent of smoke, sweat, wet stone, and worse, those luxurious tapestries you might imagine on the walls. They weren't just for decoration. They were insulation against both cold and odors. But perhaps the hardest part of surviving a medieval castle night wasn't the discomfort. It was the uncertainty, because unlike today, where doors lock, lights switch off, and silence signals safety, medieval castles didn't rest. Even the act of sleep was performed in a state of alertness. People didn't wear loose clothing. They slept in tunics or padded shirts. They kept boots near the bed. They braced their doors. They didn't sleep through the night. They drifted in and out, because if a fire started, or a gate gave way, or a rival sent a midnight rider, you had to be able to move fast. And if you were a guest, especially an outsider, your life depended on how well you adapted to the rhythms of a place that didn't know you, didn't trust you, and wouldn't wait for you to catch up. So, when we say you wouldn't survive a night in a medieval castle, it's not because you'd be attacked or imprisoned, it's because you wouldn't rest. You wouldn't relax. And come morning, you wouldn't feel the same. Even if you made it through the first few hours in a medieval castle without getting lost, stepping into the wrong chamber, or being mistaken for an intruder, a new kind of discomfort would start to settle in. The quiet weight of isolation. Because castles weren't built for warmth. Not physically, and not socially. Let's start with the stone. The walls, no matter how many tapestries or animal hides hung on them, were cold. Always cold. Even in midsummer. The temperature inside a castle was at the mercy of thick masonry, poor ventilation, and flickering, inconsistent firelight. Bedrooms were designed more like protective shells than comfortable retreats. They were spaces to hide in, not to enjoy. That you'd likely be assigned a chamber on a floor that wasn't even fully enclosed. Upper towers often had slitted windows, permanently open to the air, and no glass. Just gaps. And if you were unlucky enough to be placed near the outer curtain wall, you'd feel every gust. You'd hear every scrape of branch, every shift of wind. You'd spend more time wondering what was outside your walls than sleeping inside them. And that isolation wasn't just physical. Castles had hierarchy embedded into their stones. If you were unfamiliar with the people, not a noble, not a trusted retainer, you were immediately marked as an outsider. You weren't ignored. You were observed, quietly, from the corners of corridors, from behind half-closed doors. You might be served food, given a space to sleep, even offered politeness, but not warmth. Servants wouldn't make small talk. Guards wouldn't answer questions. If you asked too many, you'd be seen as suspicious. If you asked none, you'd be called distant. Either way, you were alone. Letters from a 14th century Venetian emissary staying at a northern English stronghold described the sensation clearly. They fed me meat and ale and gave me straw for my horse. But every man watched me as though I might open a gate with my breath. And keep in mind, most castles weren't bustling palaces. They were remote, surrounded by hills, forests, or coastlines. No nearby towns. No inns. No comfort zone to slip. A way to dot if you needed anything after nightfall, food, water, warmth, you had to ask for it, or find it, and that required navigating a silent, suspicious household in total darkness. Many guests chose to stay in their rooms entirely, fearful of crossing some invisible line, and that fear wasn't always irrational. Many castle owners operated on precaution above courtesy. If you entered a hallway meant for retainers, or a stairwell, leading to private quarters, or God's forbid, a military storehouse, punishment could be swift. No one would hurt you, but your belongings might be searched. Your departure might be encouraged earlier than planned. You might even be locked in your room until morning for your safety. That kind of vigilance was born from necessity. Medieval power was fragile. Assassinations, raids, rivalries, they didn't happen often, but they happened enough. Every castle had its stories. Every lord had lost sleep at least once over a visitor who asked one too many questions or stayed one night too long. And the result of that tension? You, the guest, curled up on a rough cot, a thin blanket over your shoulders, a distant torch sputtering in the hallway, listening to footsteps that never seemed to stop, wondering if anyone even remembered your name. Because in a medieval castle, you weren't just alone. You were surrounded by watchful eyes, thick walls, and a silence that never quite settled. And that was only the second hour of the night. If you stepped into a medieval castle at night, not a recreated one, not a museum tour with exit signs and visitor maps, but a real one in the 14th century, built for defense rather than hospitality, the first thing you'd notice wouldn't be the chill or the damp. It would be the sound. Or rather, the absence of the right kind of sound. Not silence in the way we think of silence today. No soft hum of distant traffic. No quiet click of heating systems. No white noise from appliances. No, castle silence was something else entirely. It was a stone-bound vacuum. The kind that didn't make you feel alone, but observed. It swallowed every footstep, magnified every breath, and made the most trivial motion feel loud enough to wake the entire estate. This was a space carved out of the landscape, built to isolate and built to last. And at night, it reminded you of that. Even the smallest action, shifting on a wooden bed frame, adjusting a leather strap, unrolling a cloak, produced a sound you couldn't ignore. These noises didn't blend in or fade out. They echoed, repeated, hung in the air like unanswered questions. In castles, the acoustics weren't just strange, they were unpredictable. A whisper spoken in a stairwell might be heard clearly, at the bottom, distorted and ghostly, while a shout in the hall might die quickly against the thick masonry. Sometimes you'd think you heard a conversation happening nearby, but it was just the wind funneling through slits in the stone. Other times, what seemed like a whisper near your ear was actually someone 2 floors below dragging a bucket across the ground. People who lived in castles knew this. They learned to identify individuals by the rhythm of their walking. The way a guard's armor clanked was different from the softer shuffle of a barefoot servant. A steward would step in a certain cadence. The cook moved with a particular heaviness. Night after night, your ears learned the identities of the people around you based on footsteps, coughs, even the subtle brush of linen skirts against stone. But if you were a guest, someone unfamiliar with the layout, the sound signatures, the timing, then everything was uncertain. The noise that pulled you out of sleep at 2 a.m. might be harmless. Or it might not be. Let's talk architecture. Medieval castles weren't designed with comfort in mind. They were built for war, for watching, for waiting. Walls were often several feet thick. Ceilings were vaulted or supported with heavy timber beams. Floors were stone or rough wooden planks that swelled and shifted with the seasons. Doors creaked not because they were neglected, but because they were massive. Hinges had to bear the weight of thick oak slabs. And the way sound traveled, especially at night, was unlike anything we experience now. In a city, noise becomes background. In a castle, it becomes foreground. You hear everything. the drip of rain leaking through a slit window onto the stone, the groan of a wooden door settling deeper into its frame, the tap of some metal tool accidentally left near the hearth, cooling and contracting. And in the middle of that quiet, one creak of a floorboard feels personal, deliberate. Many castles had long corridors that curved subtly, not for aesthetic purposes, but for defense. These bends blocked the direct path of an intruder, but they also made it impossible to see very far ahead at night. Firelight didn't bend around corners. A torch on the wall 10 feet away cast no light on the hallway ahead. You would see one pool of flickering orange glow, and then complete blackness beyond it. That blackness wasn't just physical. It was psychological. It pressed in, and combined with the acoustics, it made movement terrifying. A person could be standing just around the bend, breathing, watching, and you'd never know until they spoke, or stepped, or did nothing, and simply waited. You wouldn't sleep well, not because the bed was hard or the air was cold, although both would be true, but because the structure itself made rest suspicious. Your ears would stay alert long after your body wanted to relax. You'd listen for signs of life in a building designed more to observe than to comfort. And you wouldn't know how much of what you were hearing was real, or remembered, or imagined. Point 1. 14th century guest to a fortress in Wales wrote, "The stones remember walking. I lay awake and heard them stretch." Of course, the stones didn't move, but they responded. A shift in the weather, a change in temperature, and the walls might groan, especially those held together with iron staples or timber pegs, which would swell and contract. The stone sounded like it was alive, in the way trees creak in forests. Only this wasn't nature. This was structure, intention, walls built by men, inhabited by others, and passed down like memory. And in the silence, it all became too much. Some castles developed internal rules to manage nighttime silence. No unnecessary movement past sundown. No opening of storerooms or cellars until dawn. Guards walked slowly, deliberately. Servants often removed their shoes. Children were kept in the innermost rooms, not for protection from danger, but to prevent them from waking the household with wandering dreams that in larger estates. Certain halls were blocked at night by benches or carts, not to prevent access, but to send a message: no passage now. If a person did move through those spaces, the sound of them shifting the obstacle would alert others. Everyone heard everything, even in noble families, people often shared rooms. This wasn't just for warmth, it was for awareness. If someone got up, the others would know. If a door opened, multiple heads would lift. There was security in collective listening. So imagine being alone. In a guest chamber, with thick walls, a locked door, and darkness settling in like water. You'd start to wonder, was that knock on the beam just the structure settling? Was the sound in the corridor just wind? Was that whisper real? And why does the wall feel like it's leaning in, just a little? By morning, you'd be tired. Not from what happened, but from what didn't. From holding yourself still so long. From listening to every corner of the room as though it might answer. In a medieval castle, silence was never absence. It was attention, awareness, a network of stone and air and sound, all holding its breath. With you in the middle of it, you weren't in danger. But you also weren't quite safe, because at night, the castle didn't protect you. It observed you, and it remembered. By day, medieval castles were imposing but orderly. You could understand their layout with a little time. Halls led to kitchens, stairs led to bedrooms, courtyards opened onto gardens or walls. Everything had a function. Everything had a purpose. But there was one part of nearly every castle that even longtime residents hesitated to visit after sundown. The cellars. Not dungeons. Those came later, and not all castles had them. No, we're talking about the original, practical cellars. Deep storage rooms, often carved directly into the bedrock. They were meant to preserve food, wine, grain, sometimes tools. sometimes wool or parchment or valuable items kept from public view. In theory, they were just basements, but in practice, they were different. Start with the light. There wasn't any. Most castle cellars didn't have windows. If they did, the openings were so narrow they served more for ventilation than illumination. The only way to see was with a torch or a candle, and even then, you wouldn't see far. The air was thick, and the stone walls absorbed flame rather than reflecting it. A single torch might light a hall upstairs, but down here, it barely lit your own hands. And sound? Sound was even worse than upstairs. Above ground, a creaking floorboard might echo once or twice before fading. But below ground, in tight stone tunnels and barrel-vaulted chambers, noise lingered. A cough bounced back at you. A footstep returned as three. The act of walking created its own rhythm, a rhythm that felt uncomfortably close to following theirs. A reason so many castle inventories mention lantern hooks set into the walls at regular intervals. They weren't decorative. They were survival tools, keeping your hands free, your path forward clear, and your shadows in front of you where they belonged. Even in daylight, few people entered the cellars alone, not because they feared attack or accident, but because they feared losing the thread of direction. Castle blueprints were rarely symmetrical. Storage rooms wrapped around support pillars or dipped suddenly into side corridors. A single misstep, and you'd find yourself facing three identical doors, none labeled, all closed. You might be only a few feet from the stairs, but you'd feel miles away. Some of these spaces weren't planned at all. As castles expanded, builders carved out new rooms from existing stone. They added supports, braced the ceilings, and sometimes left half-finished corridors behind locked gates. These unfinished segments were dark, colder than the rest, and almost completely silent. And yet, they stayed, part of the structure, part of the memory of the place. A few were used to store things. Most were not. But the oddest thing about castle cellars wasn't how dark or quiet they were to it, was how rarely they were mentioned. For a space so essential to the function of the household, cellar levels were practically ignored in day-to-day records. Ledgers note when barrels were removed. Servants' accounts log when salt was fetched or candles were inventoried. But almost no one describes the cellars themselves. Not their layout, not their atmosphere, not their conditions. It's as if they were simply endured, not experienced. And that silence, historical silence, tells its own story, because spaces without narrative invite imagination. It didn't take long for the reputation of castle cellars to grow. Children were told to stay away from the stairs. New servants were warned not to loiter below ground. Guests were advised not to explore beyond the torches. Over time, this translated into design changes. Secondary doors were locked after sundown. Stairwells were barred with thick wooden hatches. A cellar that once stored dried herbs or apples became a locked room with no name. One record from a small Norman stronghold in 1282 reads simply, "The southern vault was braced shut. 2 candles were left to burn and the key returned." It doesn't say why. It doesn't explain what happened, and it doesn't need to, because by then, people understood that certain spaces didn't belong to nighttime. Here's the truth about medieval life. Very little space was considered empty. A hallway was a passage. A chamber was a resting place. A kitchen, a hearth. But cellars? Cellars were spaces that didn't have clear associations with people. They weren't places to be. They were places to take something from and leave. Quickly, with purpose. And in an age when people believed the human presence was what kept chaos at bay, where hearth smoke, prayer, and daily routine shaped a kind of protective barrier. The absence of daily rhythm made cellar rooms feel wrong, not haunted, just uncivilized, untamed, which is why, over time, even the most practical families started avoiding the deeper chambers after sunset. They learned to get their food before dusk. They stored what they needed upstairs during winter. They scheduled inventories for midday. They made rules that no one would be punished for refusing a nighttime errand, so long as the errand led underground. Even today, in castles that have stood for 600 or 700 years, these spaces still feel off. You can visit. 1. Step into the cool air. Listen to your own breathing bounce back at you. Watch your flashlight struggle to reach the next wall, and you'll understand, immediately, why medieval people designed homes where so much of the usable square footage was deliberately sealed off at night. Because you can light a torch, you can say a prayer, you can even bring company. But once the door closes behind you, and the air shifts, and the quiet returns, you'll remember what they knew. Some rooms weren't made for rest. They were made to be left behind. If you'd somehow managed to survive the cold, navigate the treacherous halls, and avoid the cellars altogether, there was still one final truth you had to accept before the night truly settled in. You were never truly alone. Not in the romantic sense. Not in the metaphorical sense. Literally, physically, and absolutely, someone else was awake, listening, watching. This wasn't about paranoia. It was about design. Medieval castles were not homes in the way we understand homes today. They were strongholds, fortresses, military installations. Even when inhabited by nobility and filled with laughter during feasts or solemn quiet during holy days, their fundamental purpose remained: control, defense, and containment, which meant surveillance, not with cameras or mirrors or magic, but with people. A network of watchers, listeners, guards, servants, and attendants whose very existence depended on moving through the castle without being noticed and without making a sound. By midnight, when most noble families were asleep behind heavy oak doors, the real movement began. Guards patrolled the battlements, not for show, but because they had to. An unlit torch on a distant wall could mean a failing post. A cold hearth could mean someone forgot their place. A single footprint in a hallway could signal a broken rule. So these sentinels moved slowly, heavily armored or entirely silent depending on their role. They didn't knock. They didn't speak. They didn't stop unless they heard something that shouldn't be heard. Worse still were the internal watchmen, assigned not to defend the castle from outsiders, but to manage the behavior of those already within. Large castles had night stewards, corridor monitors, fire watchers, and in some regions, even night auditors, men tasked with making sure that servants hadn't hidden in pantries or nooks to avoid finishing their duties. These auditors carried short staffs tipped with iron, not weapons, just enough to tap on stone and wood and ensure someone startled in response. And when they didn't get a response, they waited. Because in a medieval castle, stillness was suspicious. Architecturally, many castles were designed with hidden alcoves, spiral staircases with blind turns, servant passageways that bypassed the main chambers entirely. You might be walking a corridor at dusk, alone, and not know that someone, an attendant, a steward, a page, was only 6 feet away, concealed behind a thin partition or a wall meant for moving goods. These weren't secret in the dramatic sense. They were functional. They existed so the house could run even while the lord slept. But that also meant that you were rarely unseen, even when you thought you were alone. Castle etiquette reflected this. In some noble households, servants were taught to cough gently when entering a room at night, just loud enough to declare presence without disturbing. Others were told to look downward unless directly addressed, not out of humility, but to avoid making others feel watched, because even those with power felt it. That sense, that slight breath of presence behind you as you crossed a hallway lit only by guttering tallow candles. That flicker of movement at the corner of your eye while turning down the stairs. That impression, not quite sound, not quite shadow, that someone had just rounded the opposite corner a heartbeat before you did. We like to imagine medieval castles as isolated and drafty, and they were. But they were also crowded, peopled, layered with movement and purpose. You might pass through 6 rooms between supper and bed and not see a soul, but that didn't mean the rooms were empty. It just meant the people inside didn't want to be seen. And then, of course, there were the rituals. In some regions, castle staff would perform what were called night assurances, a system of signaling that everything in the household was as it should be. This might involve blowing gently on an ember in a hallway brazier, producing a puff of smoke, or turning a latch twice at a door so it made a particular double click. These weren't official codes. They were habits, but everyone learned them, which is why any deviation from the expected rhythm would send ripples through the household. That a door closed only once instead of twice. A window opened an inch wider than it should have been. A candle that burned out faster than it should have. And when that happened, the watchers moved. There's an account from a 14th century castle in southern France in which a visiting nobleman was chastised the morning after his arrival. He had gotten up during the night to relieve himself and accidentally unbolted a storage door instead of his own chamber. The movement was silent, but a steward noticed the bolt was reversed during his rounds. A team of 6 servants and 2 guards searched the hallways for nearly 2 hours, not because they expected a thief, but because the rhythm had broken, and that was enough to assume something was wrong and no one was punished. But the next night, that door was hammered shut from the outside. If you found yourself in a medieval castle, surviving the evening chill and the darkness was only part of the challenge. The real test was in behaving correctly, knowing when to speak and when not to, where to look, when to lock your door, how to move from chamber to chamber without causing concern, and most importantly, how not to be noticed by the wrong people at the wrong hour, because the watchers were not malicious. They were not cruel. They were doing their jobs. But in a world where safety came from structure and structure came from vigilance, any deviation, intentional or not, was a threat. And threats weren't tolerated. Not after sundown. You've made it to your bed. If you're lucky, it's not just a pile of straw. Maybe it's an actual mattress, slightly raised, stuffed with wool or hay, covered in a coarse linen sheet. There's even a blanket, a good one, thick and heavy. The candle is out. The chamber is quiet. You're alone. The door is locked, and yet you can't sleep, because now, with everything still, the castle begins to breathe, not in a poetic way, in a literal, audible, physical way. Medieval castles were made of stone, wood, mortar, and iron. These materials don't sleep. They shift, expand, contract, groan under their own weight. The beams above your head creak. The floorboards sigh. The walls pop with sudden, sharp cracks that echo down corridors and across ceilings like distant footsteps. This isn't haunting. It's architecture. But at 2 a.m., the difference doesn't matter. Even the smallest castle is a living structure. And you, lying there in a dark, windowless room with a heavy ceiling above and thicker walls on every side, begin to realize just how loud silence can be. There is no modern insulation, no soundproofing, no consistent temperature. Air moves through stone halls in strange ways, sometimes whispering, sometimes howling. And in castles built with layered stone, even the wind can get lost, creating moaning sounds that seem to travel through the floor. And yet, people did sleep. They had to, but never deeply, never carelessly, because sleep in a medieval castle was a calculated act, even for nobility, especially for nobility. Let's start with your sleeping arrangements. If you're a guest, you might be in a private chamber, but it's likely not truly private. Servants often slept in the same room, or just outside. If you're part of the household, you might be on a shared platform bed, with a curtain drawn between you and the others. If you're a guard or a retainer, you sleep near the outer wall, where the cold is constant and the stones weep with condensation. Now imagine that you need to get up in the night. There is no soft light. There are no slippers. You light a taper, or reuse a glowing ember from the brazier, if it hasn't gone out. You step barefoot on freezing flagstone or uneven planks. The walls, earlier warmed by the sun or fire, are now icy and close. The hallway is pitch black. You don't know what or who. You might walk into. In fact, many people didn't walk at all. They waited. If your chamber pot was full, if your water jug was empty, if your blanket had slid off the bed, you waited until morning. Because opening your door meant exposing yourself to watchers, drafts, rats, and sometimes worse. In certain castles, especially those near contested territories or in politically unstable regions, sleeping came with one additional rule: never remove your outer tunic completely. Why? Because if a bell rang, signaling an attack, fire, or escape, you were expected to be ready to move within 30 seconds. Some lords imposed fines on retainers who failed to report to the main hall in under a minute, even in the dead of night. It wasn't cruelty, it was necessity. Every delay made the castle more vulnerable, and so, even in sleep, there was no true rest. There was only pause. Your dreams were shaped by what you heard. The whisper of someone coughing 3 rooms away. The sudden clatter of a cup dropped by a careless servant. The deep, slow toll of the bell marking 3rd watch. The low roar of wind catching in the corner tower and howling like a living thing. And worst of all, the moments of complete silence. Because when the castle went truly quiet, people listened harder. They lay still and stared into the dark, counting heartbeats, wondering if they'd missed something. Silence in a castle was never comforting. It was suspicious. Something had paused, or hidden, or was waiting. Some households kept dogs indoors not for protection, but for warning. If the dog slept soundly, the castle was safe. If it growled in its sleep, or perked up its ears toward the hall, people took notice. And even for the elite, for those sleeping in grand 4-poster beds beneath painted ceilings and draped in embroidered sheets, there were other discomforts. The weight of responsibility. Castles weren't only homes. They were centers of governance. A nobleman might go to bed with the knowledge that messengers were riding toward him with news of war, that guests in the East Wing had come bearing ill tidings, that the steward had shorted the grain ledger, that the cellarer suspected water. Brought in the main storeroom that a castle lord did not sleep peacefully. He slept prepared, ready to rise, ready to command, ready to defend. Even the beds reflected this. In some noble households, the bedposts had built-in mechanisms to quickly hang or tie on outer garments or swords. Some had stools placed beside them, not for comfort, but to stand on, in case the windows were too high and an escape was needed. In border castles, trapdoors weren't uncommon, leading not to escape tunnels, but to hidden compartments where documents, keys, or even family members could be hidden if needed. And if you weren't noble, if you were a servant, a messenger, a minor knight, you slept with the knowledge that your name could be called at any hour. No excuse, no delay, one knock, one voice, one candle appearing in the dark. So when we imagine what it was like to sleep in a medieval castle, we must forget the fantasy. There were no long, restful slumbers beside crackling fireplaces. There were no cozy nights curled under blankets, listening to soft rain on the stone. There was tension, expectation, the sense that your rest was borrowed, conditional, that the castle, vast and heavy and living around you, might ask something of you before dawn. And when it did, you needed to be ready, because in a medieval castle, sleep wasn't a right. It was a privilege, and privileges, like fires, had to be constantly tended, or they disappeared in the dark. Now you're lying in the dark, awake again. Maybe the wind changed. Maybe your dream ended too quickly. Maybe your foot brushed against the stone wall beside your bed, and the chill of it pulled you back into awareness. Whatever the reason, your eyes are open, the candle is out, and there it is again, a sound that in a castle. Sounds do not behave the way they do in modern buildings. They don't stay in their place. They travel. They ricochet. They grow louder in passageways where they should fade. They whisper from above when they originated below. And no matter how thick the stone, nothing is ever completely silent. The architecture was never designed for comfort. It was designed for survival, for intimidation, for defense. That means tall ceilings, bare walls, narrow windows. Every noise, from a footstep to a whispered word, gets stretched and distorted. It becomes unplaceable. You hear something again. It might have been a cough, or the creak of a door, or a beam in the roof shifting slightly under the weight of cold air. But in your half-sleep, it might also have been a footstep, a human breath, a whisper that stopped just as you noticed it. You try to ignore it, but medieval people didn't have that luxury. They didn't just hear noises. They responded to them. A clink of metal could mean a thief. A groan in the walls could signal collapse. A rhythm, repeating, intentional, could be someone moving where they shouldn't. And in a place where everyone's role was tightly defined, any unexpected sound raised suspicion. Guards were taught to distinguish between wind and movement, between birds and breath, between normal and not. They walked corridors in shifts, each footstep echoing more than once. You never knew if it was one man approaching or three. So you waited, and it wasn't just guards who listened. Servants did too. Cooks, pages, stewards. Everyone had learned, over years, to catalog the nightly noises of the castle, to know which door scraped, which stair popped, which gate latch whined when the iron swelled in the cold. These were not superstitions, they were survival instincts, because the worst sounds were the ones no one could explain. Take, for example, the phenomenon of floor thumps. In many castles, especially in upper chambers, inhabitants reported hearing sharp, deliberate sounds, like something heavy being dropped on wood. Only no one was above them. No one had moved. Nothing had fallen. And yet, the sound would repeat. A dull, low knock. Then again. Then silence. Some blamed the structure itself. Old beams shifting. Others suspected rats or cats. But when multiple people heard it from different rooms at once, nobody said anything at all. Silence was often the default. Not because no one was curious, but because asking made it real. Even more disconcerting were sounds from stairwells. Stone spiral stairs were notorious for amplifying the softest of sounds. A single boot step could echo up 2 stories. And there were always boot steps. At least, it felt that way. One night it might be the steward doing his rounds. The next, it might be someone checking the east tower. The next, no one could remember who had been assigned. So people stayed alert, just in case. And when no one confessed to being the source of the sound, people remembered. They watched more carefully the next day. They whispered about it the next evening. A sound that couldn't be claimed was worse than a scream. It was an absence of accountability. And in a castle, that was dangerous. Sometimes the sounds weren't threatening, just deeply unsettling, like the scrape of wool slippers on stone, or the sound of someone humming, faintly, behind a closed door. Or, worse, the unmistakable rustle of parchment, as if someone were flipping through a book or document long after everyone had gone to bed. That a monk in a small keep near Tours once wrote in his personal notes that he stopped sleeping in the scriptorium chamber because he woke 3 nights in a row to the sound of leaves being turned with haste, though none were present. No investigation was ever made. They simply locked the door from the outside from then on. This is how it worked. When something could not be explained, it was isolated, not discussed, just contained, and life went on. And this brings us to one final point. The layered memories of sound in a castle that has stood for decades, or even centuries. The stone itself becomes a memory. Sounds seem to linger. People would swear that a certain hallway always carried a whisper when no one was there. That the base of a certain turret always echoed twice. No matter how softly you walked, it wasn't paranormal. It wasn't irrational. It was repetition. Hundreds of nights, hundreds of lives, hundreds of sounds, all recorded unconsciously into the expectations of those who lived there. And so, you learn to adapt. You stop asking, You stop reacting, because surviving a night in a medieval castle wasn't about facing danger. It was about accepting uncertainty, about sharing space with echoes, drafts, and footsteps you didn't cause. It was about sleeping with your eyes half closed and your ears fully open. Because here, when the candle dies out and the hallway falls quiet, the castle doesn't sleep, and neither do you. You'd think the most dangerous place in a medieval castle would be its gates, its outer walls, its battlements. That's where attacks happened, right? That's where you'd expect conflict. But ask anyone who's truly lived inside castle walls. Anyone who's kept the fires burning or stored the wine or fetched water after sundown. And they'll tell you, the scariest place was down below. The places where light barely reached. The cellars, the storerooms, the crypts. 18 night, you didn't go there. Not unless you had to. And even then, you didn't go alone. Castles were vertical creatures. Up top, you had the halls, the bedrooms, the chambers where people slept and worked. These spaces, though cold and Spartan, were at least alive. There were sounds, movements, a fireplace, voices. But beneath all that, beneath the kitchens and the stairwells, there were spaces carved for function, not comfort. Storage, containment, preservation, and silence. The lower you went, the colder it became, and the darker. Many of these areas were built partially underground, with no windows at all. Candles flickered and smoked against the damp air. Walls sweated, ceilings dripped. You learned quickly to carry 2 candles, not one, because if the first guttered out, you were stuck. No one would hear you. No one would come looking. And even if they did, there were no landmarks in the dark. Just corridors, crates, barrels, stairs, walls, more walls. But the fear wasn't just about getting lost at IT, it was about what these places were used for. In many castles, the lowest levels had a purpose that no one talked about too loudly. Some were used as makeshift prisons, holding areas for thieves or rebels or people who owed too much tax. Others were storage for grain and meat and salt. And some were neither. Some were old, older than the castle itself, especially in Europe, where castles were often built on top of Roman ruins, burial grounds, or previous settlements. Foundations that predated memory. Rooms with walls that didn't quite match the ones above. Doorways sealed off. Spiral staircases that ended in rubble or in nothing at all. And yet sometimes, those staircases weren't sealed. They were just ignored. There are countless journals from stewards, pages, and clergy describing their unease with castle lower levels. Not because of ghosts, not because of monsters, but because they changed, doors that wouldn't stay shut, drafts from places that should be solid, storage rooms that seemed one size one day, and smaller the next point. One page from a Welsh stronghold wrote of a wine room that echoed differently each week. Another described retrieving oil lamps from a box at the base of a cellar only to find the box missing the next day, though no one else had been assigned to use IT. IT wasn't always malevolent. It was just wrong. Most households developed rituals to deal with these spaces. In some castles, only certain servants were allowed to go down after nightfall. In others, no one went down at all until first light, no matter what was needed. Fires could go out. Doors could bang. No one descended until sunrise. Locks weren't always enough. People started wedging door frames with stones, setting brooms or stools across thresholds so they'd hear if someone or something opened them. In one manor house in East Anglia, a record from 1341 states, "No woman nor boy shall be tasked to the root cellar alone, nor pass the bell of dusk, lest misfortune follow." Notice the language there. Not fear, not horror. Misfortune. The concern wasn't that something evil would happen. It was that something strange might. Something that didn't have a name. The lower levels of castles weren't all carved with purpose. Some were adapted, repurposed. As stones shifted and seasons changed, what was once a granary might become a storeroom. What was once a storage space for rope might now hold vinegar or oil, but memory lingers. And humans notice. And when people sense that a room doesn't feel like what it's supposed to be anymore, they stop going there at night. Because the more time you spend in a place without sound, without warmth, without light, the more you start to imagine that it wants you to stay. One chilling account comes from a steward's assistant in a Scottish keep. He was asked to fetch a wrapped bundle of cloth from the lowest level, 4 stairs down, beneath the kitchen storage. He took a lantern. He didn't return. When found the next morning, the assistant was unharmed but shaking. The bundle lay nearby. When asked what had happened, he said only this: "I heard a voice. I do not know the words. I do not wish to hear them again." No investigation followed. The storeroom was resealed. The steward retired a month later. And yet, despite the fear, the cellars were necessary. Food had to be kept cold. Meat had to hang. Salt had to stay dry. Tools needed storing. And people, ordinary people, were the ones sent to manage it. They did so quietly, efficiently, without question, but always during the day. And if they had to go at night, they went. Quickly, they spoke aloud, not to frighten anything away, but to remind themselves they were still there. In a castle, darkness had weight that it pressed in from below. It crept up staircases. It found cracks between stones, and no candle could ever quite drive it out completely. So you learn to avoid it, to stay close to the hearth, to sleep with your back to a wall, and to never ask someone to fetch something from the basement after the fire's gone out. Because in the belly of a medieval castle, things waited. Not ghosts, not demons, just things. Things best left unnamed. Things best left undisturbed. By the time the sun dropped below the distant trees and the last orange light vanished behind the hills, the castle didn't just become dark. It became smaller, narrower, quieter in a way that wasn't peace, but pressure. Sounds that echoed. During the day, horses in the courtyard, blacksmiths in the forge, boots on the stone steps, fell away. And what remained wasn't silence, but the kind of stillness that made you hear things you wouldn't notice otherwise. The creak of a rafter, the long, slow settling of a wooden beam, the faint rustling of a rush mat under its own weight, or your own breath, suddenly loud in a hallway where no one else had passed for hours. Medieval castles were full of people, yes, but also full of space. Gaps between floors, rooms that weren't used anymore, small staircases that ended in bricked-off passages, tiny, doorless corridors that led behind walls or between chambers. There were practical reasons for this. Construction was rarely linear, especially in old castles built over older foundations. Rooms were added where they fit. Stairs were carved where stone allowed. But function didn't explain everything. Some spaces simply weren't meant to be visited anymore. And yet, they remained at 18 night. The people who lived in the castle adjusted. Voices dropped. Fires were banked. Curtains were drawn. Doors were shut, firmly, completely, and rarely reopened until morning. Not because of superstition, though many believed in such things, but because the rhythm of the place demanded it. The castle, like the people within it, seemed to draw inward after dark. Lights were few, candles were rationed, and no one went walking just to walk. You moved only when needed, and even then, you moved quickly, with purpose. There are accounts from attendants, stewards, and night servants, people assigned to keep the hearth smoldering or to answer the calls of their lords, who described the same feeling again and again. Not fear, not danger, but the sense that the building was listening. That once the sun had gone, the castle itself became something different. Not unfriendly, necessarily, just alert, watching, waiting, as if it wanted stillness and resented interruption. The same door that swung easily during the day might jam at night. The hallway that seemed short by torchlight could feel twice as long when your footsteps were the only ones echoing. Some servants left markers along routes they were forced to walk after sundown. a strip of cloth tied to a banister, a pebble, placed on a ledge, to be certain they hadn't become turned around. Because some swore that halls curved when they hadn't before. That turns led to unexpected corners. That the castle, in the dark, changed, and what are the sounds? Not loud sounds, not screams or moans, just soft, persistent things. A tap, a shift, the soft slide of leather against stone. People explain these things. Of course they did. Mice, cats, the wind pressing against shutters, old stone settling into older earth. And maybe that was true. Maybe it was always true. But it didn't stop anyone from waiting until morning that there's an old practice mentioned in a document from the mid-1300s, a rule among kitchen boys in a Bavarian stronghold, that no one should carry uncooked meat down the South Passage after dark. Not because it spoiled, not because it attracted dogs, but because, they wrote, the weight of raw flesh draws company. What kind of company, they didn't say, and they didn't need to. Even nobles avoided movement after nightfall. Most great lords had guards posted not only to protect them, but to carry light and walk ahead in unfamiliar parts of their own homes. Because even the powerful understood the difference between owning a place in daylight and navigating it alone in darkness. The stone walls, during the day, seemed solid, comforting even, protection. But by night, they were different. They were heavy, cold, watching. The great fireplaces that once filled the hall with warmth now stood like hollow mouths. The tapestries no longer softened the echoes, but seemed to shudder with unseen drafts. And so you stayed in your room, if you were lucky enough to have one. You latched the door. You checked the window. You kept the candle nearby, but didn't light it unless needed. Because light was a message. Light meant someone was awake, someone was alert. And not everyone wanted to send that signal. The best thing you could do in a medieval castle at night was sleep. And the next best thing was pretend to. Because if you lay awake too long, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the shifting of the stones above you, you might begin to hear footsteps that didn't belong to anyone you knew. Or breathing that didn't match your own. Or worse, you might hear nothing at all, and realize that something else was listening instead. By the 10th hour of the night, even the castle's stones seemed to grow colder. Not just the floor beneath bare feet, but the walls, the corners where two blocks met, the spaces beneath windows, the old crevices where lime and ash had worn thin. The chill wasn't always natural. Many who lived within those halls said it was something else. A quiet reminder that the castle didn't sleep when you did. It simply waited that a noble's chamber might appear grand in the daylight. Four-post bed, carved chest, fine canopy. But at night, grandeur turned hollow. Shadows moved without breeze. Candlelight warped tapestries into scenes that no artist intended. You could wake and not know, for a moment, if the shapes across the room belonged to your belongings, or something else entirely. Many noble women kept bells on their bedposts, not for summoning servants, for sanity, for checking quietly, quickly, if the silence was still whole. One shake, one tiny chime. If the air swallowed the sound, all was well. If the bell jangled more than once, without touch, some simply refused to sleep the rest of the night. The corridors were worse. Long, narrow, and unpredictable. You might think castles were symmetrical. They weren't. Staircases ended in unexpected alcoves. Servants' passages split behind false walls. The deeper you went, from the chambers down to the stores, from the stores to the cellars, the more the architecture lost its reason. And in that loss of structure, imagination thrived. Not in loud, terrifying visions, but in half-seen impressions. A flicker that didn't belong to a flame. A shape that seemed taller than a man. A breath, once heard, never repeated. Guard rotations were essential, not just for protection from the outside, but because no one wanted to walk the interior halls alone. Even the most seasoned soldiers preferred to rotate in pairs when patrolling the second and third levels. And in some castles, those built over older ruins, There were routes no one assigned, doors permanently bolted, stairs that descended only 3 steps before vanishing into pitch. No one asked why. They just didn't go there. There's a record from a 14th century constable of a fortress in Bohemia. He wrote of an armory room that no one entered after dark, not for fear of theft, but because the iron buckles on the wall straps would sometimes rattle without movement. It is not wind, he wrote. There is no draft, no opening, and yet they answer one another. His solution was not to investigate. It was to lock the door and hang a strip of black wool over the latch, so he would know in the morning if someone else had tried. That same sense of passive resistance marked how most people dealt with the strangeness of night. They didn't challenge it. They didn't search it out. They simply prepared against it. Buckets were brought into rooms so no one needed to cross a hallway to relieve themselves. Shoes were arranged by the door, always in the same order, so they could be checked by touch in darkness. Some people smeared a bit of lard across their shutters, not to seal against cold, but to ensure they hadn't been opened during the night. The idea wasn't to catch someone or something in the act. It was to reassure themselves that nothing had. And then there were the listeners. In every castle, there were always 1 or 2 people, servants, scribes, stewards, who didn't sleep deeply, who heard too much. They'd tell of noises behind walls, whispering too steady to be rats, of footsteps on spiral stairs that never arrived. One spoke of music, soft strings played from below the floor with no source. Another said her sheets would sometimes feel as though someone had sat beside her in the dark, slowly, carefully, before disappearing. That it's easy to dismiss these stories. Modern minds look for drafts, faulty beams, echoes, but the people who lived these nights didn't jump to conclusions. They didn't claim demons or spirits, not unless pressed. What they described wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, repetitive, the same small strangeness, night after night. Never enough to prove, always enough to notice, and perhaps that's what made the medieval castle so difficult to survive at night. Not the danger, but the uncertainty, the waiting, the feeling that the space around you had not grown empty with the absence of sunlight, but fuller, as though something long forgotten had returned to its place now that everyone else had finally gone to sleep. There are places built to be lived in, and there are places built to be endured. A medieval castle at night was not a home. It was a boundary, one you were expected to respect, because if the stones remembered how to stay standing, then perhaps they also remembered what they were keeping inside. By the time the last torch in the corridor flickered out, the castle became a memory of itself. The grand halls where nobles once laughed over roasted game and spilled wine turned silent, not with peace, but with a kind of held breath. The kind that stretches across stones and rafters, carrying things that can't be named. This wasn't silence as comfort. It was silence that pressed on the skin. In such quiet, your own heartbeat became too loud, your breath an interruption, and the more you tried to ignore it, the more it felt like you were the only thing moving in a place that never wanted motion after dark. You'd pull your covers closer, not for warmth, but to shrink yourself, as if making less noise with your existence might convince the castle to forget you were there. In many castles, servants' quarters were located near the kitchens or up, under the roof beams, far from the noble chambers, but never far from the walls. And it was the walls that carried sound, not through whispers or cries, but through the shifting of timber, the clink of metal against stone, the sigh of old rope swinging even though no bell had been pulled. These weren't things anyone investigated. There was an understanding. The building had its own breath, its own bones. To walk around listening for its voice was a good way to be remembered by it. The guards knew this best. Night rotation wasn't brave. It was simply the cost of employment. 1 foot wrong, 1 corner turned too quickly, and you might find yourself staring into a hallway that hadn't been there the day before. Or worse, one that should have been sealed long ago. There are written records from a garrison in southern England where one hallway, short, narrow, and supposedly bricked up, was found open one night by two men patrolling. They looked down it, saw no light, and returned to report it. By morning, it was sealed again, not newly bricked, just gone, as if the castle had changed its mind in a one quit after that. No one was punished, but every man on rotation started carrying a second candle, not for seeing, for knowing. If one candle went out and the other did not, they kept walking. If both went out, no wind, no reason, they turned back. Meanwhile, within the noble chambers, comfort was thin. There was no such thing as privacy. In a medieval castle, thick walls didn't mean quiet. Heavy doors didn't mean protection. The floorboards carried sound too well. Drafts snuck through chimneys that reached 3 stories. More than one chamber had a section of the ceiling that groaned, not when you walked below it, but when the rest of the castle had already settled. Women would say it was the roof adjusting to the cold. Men would say it was rats in the beams. But no one climbed up to check. Even when nothing happened, the expectation of something happening made every minute longer. That's what wore people down. Not sudden horror, but stretched tension. A full night of watching your own candle sputter, of counting how long since the last creak, of trying to remember if the stool by the fire had always faced that direction, or whether someone had shifted it. Not all of it was imagined. In one fortress-turned-royal seat in modern-day France, several noble visitors across 2 decades wrote separate entries about the tilted hour. A brief moment just after midnight, when it felt like the entire room leaned, not dramatically, not with sound, but subtly. Enough that water in a bowl would slosh to one side. Enough that if you were standing, you'd adjust your footing. Some chalked it up to the foundation, others to poor sleep. But no other part of the castle ever displayed the same effect. And, in the servants' quarters, stories passed like currency. No screaming ghosts or winged creatures. Just experiences that all ended the same way. Someone heard something they shouldn't have. And instead of investigating, they turned over in bed and did nothing. And that nothing saved them. This was survival in a medieval castle. Not confrontation. Not courage. Stillness. The instinct to become uninteresting. To leave nothing open. Nothing moved, nothing curious. Curiosity was punished. The castle didn't need to do anything to you. It only needed to let your thoughts run fast enough to turn you against your own sense. When dawn finally broke, it didn't rush in like hope. It crept. Light didn't fall into the room. It slipped gradually, like someone easing open a door. First the grayness, then a shadow replaced by shape, then color, and then, and only then, could you exhale. Because once the sun touched the eastern tower, the castle remembered it was stone again. A place again, not a presence. And yet, even in full daylight, no one opened the wrong door. No one walked into the cellar alone. The rules weren't just for night. They were for the memory of night. And if you were smart, you carried that memory with you until you were far beyond its gates. Because even in the brightness of day, some places never quite forget the ones who try to stay curious. After sundown, the staircases were the worst. Not because of what was on them, but because of what wasn't. No torchlight reached the middle steps. The curves swallowed sound. Stone spirals had blind corners by design, meant for defense during siege. But, in peacetime, they became quiet tests of courage. You wouldn't survive a night in a medieval castle if you had to descend alone, especially not with your own candle, its glow barely reaching past your hand, flickering against the damp walls, like it wanted to retreat. It's in that spiral, halfway between floors, that the castle forgets you're a guest, and you start to feel like you don't belong. 18 night. Even your footsteps begin to sound like they aren't yours. Leather soles on worn stone produce a rhythm. But if you hesitate, if you stop mid-step, and the sound doesn't stop with you, that's when the real terror begins. Because now it's not about what's behind you. It's about what might be keeping pace. There were no handrails, no markings, Only walls that narrowed the higher you climbed, like the castle was swallowing you. You'd think the top would feel like relief. It didn't. It felt like being trapped closer to something that iron guest wings. Noble visitors often remarked on the chill. Not from the windows, that was expected, but from the floors. Several old letters from 14th century nobles note that certain rooms made the backs of their necks feel cold, even when the fire was warm. These weren't peasants with wild imaginations. These were educated men and women who described things precisely. They talked about the pressure in the corners of rooms, about the way tapestries moved when no air stirred. One woman wrote, "The fire crackles still, but the stone behind my bed feels like it's listening." And what's worse is that no one contradicted these stories. Castle attendants, handmaids, guards, they didn't comfort. They nodded, said little, kept their eyes on their tasks. Because the people who lived there, who worked under the beams and banners, knew that the castle was more than a structure. It was a keeper of patterns, and patterns didn't like disruption. That's why even small mistakes were avoided. Dropping a spoon after dark? Unlucky. Opening a window before the bell for sunrise? Bad habit. Sitting at the foot of someone else's bed to talk after curfew? Discouraged. These weren't rules enforced by punishment. They were upheld by instinct. The same instinct that made you look twice at your own reflection in a polished goblet. Not out of vanity, but because sometimes it didn't look like you were alone. Some rooms were sealed permanently, not for disrepair, but because of how people felt when they stayed there. There's record of one such chamber in a Welsh fortress where no servant would sleep, not even under threat of dismissal. The room wasn't cold. It didn't creak. But those who entered said the air felt stacked, like layers of quiet, pressed into itself. Guests didn't last the night, not from fear, but from restlessness. They'd leave by torchlight, shaken, unable to explain what unsettled them. That room was eventually bricked over. No ceremony, just gone. Even the great halls weren't exempt. During feast nights, the sound of music and laughter echoed high into the beams, but so did everything else. One castle steward recorded that during a winter solstice celebration, a flute that hadn't been played for an hour began producing single notes. Slow, intermittent. The musician wasn't near it, and no one asked questions. They simply ended. The music early thanked the guests and extinguished the hearths before the hour turned. Visitors might expect the horror to be dramatic. Chains, cries, movement in the dark. But it was never that. It was the sense of watching, of the castle not needing to act, only to observe. That was its power. To make your own thoughts your undoing that you try to sleep, knowing full well the bed had been used for centuries. That others had lain there and heard the same creaks and whispers. That the windows were once open during nights of siege. That the ceiling bore witness to deaths, to secrets, to negotiations signed at dagger point. And you'd feel it in the stillness. Not as a threat, but as a presence. Like the room never fully empties. When morning came, you might laugh. Dismiss it all as imagination. But you wouldn't forget the way the firelight felt wrong. Or how your candle sputtered when you mentioned someone's name aloud. Or how you swear you saw movement in the tapestry, but nothing else in the room had stirred that you'd leave the castle behind, thinking yourself safe in the daylight. But part of it would stay with you. Not a curse, not a ghost, just the memory of what it felt like to be somewhere that had been alive long before you arrived, and wasn't entirely done with you yet, because you didn't survive the castle. The castle just let you go. There's something strange about the way medieval castles held warmth. You'd expect thick stone walls and roaring hearths to insulate you, to keep you comfortable through the deep chill of night. But warmth in a castle wasn't comfort. It was warning. A fire that burned too steadily was watched, not for fear it might go out, but because flames that danced without cause were seen as unsettled, a sign that something in the room hadn't finished moving yet. That the walls, or the memories trapped in them, were still shifting. Every room had its story. Most weren't told aloud, not because they were frightening, but because they were understood. A chamber with one window sealed, despite no visible damage. A bench no one ever sat on. A broom kept leaning against a doorframe, not for convenience, but for reasons no one would explain. You wouldn't survive a night in a medieval castle because it didn't matter what you believed. What mattered was the rhythm. And the rhythm did not forgive disruption. By the 13th century, some castle architects had begun subtly adjusting floor plans, not to make rooms more functional, but to redirect sound. Footsteps that echoed too long were a problem. Whispers that traveled too far were worse. In one Norman stronghold, records show the steward had a carpet runner installed down the corridor near the servant quarters, not for elegance, but because the echo invited attention. No one asked what kind of attention. Servants knew never to speak across thresholds. If a doorway stood between two people, they stepped fully into the same room before exchanging words. Doors were either open or closed. Nothing in between. A door that didn't latch properly was treated like a leak in the roof, repaired, replaced, or avoided entirely, because half open meant uncertain. And uncertainty in a castle after nightfall wasn't tolerated. And then there were the animals. Cats were common, especially in storage areas, not just for keeping mice at bay, but for something far more practical. They listened. It's recorded in more than a dozen medieval household logs that cats were the only creatures who would notice subtle changes in a room before humans did. If a cat refused to enter a space after dusk, the steward might quietly bar the door. Not because he was afraid, but because the cat had already decided it was no longer safe. Owls, too, were unwelcome signs. Not for the usual reasons. No one thought them evil. But if one nested near a bedroom window and called during the second, third of the night, the occupant would be moved by morning. Superstition? Perhaps. But habits this consistent don't survive unless they serve something deeper that you'd lie in your bed, wrapped in 3 layers of wool and fur, with a candle burning low on the far table. Not for light. You wouldn't dare keep a candle close, but for reference. Because if the flame bent to the left, something had changed in the air. And in a castle, air didn't shift casually. The stone held its breath for hours, for days. It only moved when something else did that you'd stare at the heavy beams above you, wondering how many stories they could tell, how many lives had begun and ended in this exact bed, how many arguments echoed in the stone long after voices fell silent. You wouldn't want to sleep, not because of fear, but because sleeping would mean letting your guard down. And everything about the castle's architecture whispered against that instinct. Even the tapestries, so often seen as decorations, were there for more than warmth. They muffled certain noises. They caught the chill where it shouldn't be. They moved, occasionally, but never on their own, only when the balance in the room was off. And once it was off, you didn't trust it to reset without intervention. That's why tapestries were weighed with hidden chains at the bottom. Not to keep them still in the breeze, but to prevent them from being caught on anything moving between the walls. Visitors never stayed long. Not truly. Nobles and guests arrived with retinues, filled the halls with conversation, games, music, food. But even the most confident men left by dawn if they arrived too close to dusk. There's a letter from a baron who slept one night too, many in a northern keep, describing how he awoke to find the fire still burning, but no smoke rising. The heat was there, he wrote, but the fire did not speak. He left that morning without breakfast. Castle staff developed entire systems for handling the unseen. The way lanterns were checked twice, once when lit, once an hour later. The way shoes were always placed facing outward, toward the door, so nothing unfamiliar could try them on during the night. The practice of not sweeping hearth ashes after dark, as it was believed you might scatter more than just soot. Some courtyards were never entered after sunset, even if the gate was open, even if livestock wandered inside. The gardener's assistant at one French chateau refused to retrieve. A lost goat once the hour bell had rung. "It is his goat now," he said, and no one asked who he was. You wouldn't survive a night in a medieval castle. Not because you'd die, but because you'd leave changed. You'd leave quieter, more alert. You'd find yourself checking your door twice back home, watching the way the candle flickers, even when the windows are shut. You'd remember the way the stone floor felt, how it seemed to push back when you walked over it. Like the building noticed your weight, like it hadn't decided yet whether to let you leave. That's the danger of the night in a castle. It doesn't have to frighten you. It just has to remember you. You wouldn't realize it at first, but castles had listening points. Not built on purpose, never designed with intent, but formed over time. Places where the architecture seemed to gather sound rather than echo it. A stairwell that held on to footsteps a little longer. A corner near the chapel where whispered conversations hung in the air a second too late. These weren't traps. They weren't dangers. They were thresholds. The kind that didn't mark a change in space, but a shift in awareness. And if you stayed in a medieval castle overnight, you'd eventually find one. Not because you were looking for it, but because you'd accidentally stand in one. Usually just after midnight. Usually while alone. It's hard to explain. But once you were in it, everything became a little too clear. The way your breath sounded, the faintest draft against your wrist, the pop of the wood near the fire, not alarming, just too precisely timed. You'd step away casually, but the silence behind you would feel different than the silence ahead. These were places no one marked, but everyone avoided. By the time castles became military symbols of power, most of these spaces were already built. You couldn't remove them. They had settled. You couldn't seal them with doors because they didn't depend on walls. They followed angles. Wait, the direction of beams and stone. And you'd notice it most in the quiet hours after the castle had fallen asleep. Not truly silent. There were always soft movements, the clatter of pots in distant kitchens, the shift of guards outside. But there was a hush that settled deeper than silence. One that seemed to press against the ears. A pressure that made you feel like something was listening, even when no one was there. The people who lived in castles, permanently, developed their own routines for this. Not superstition, not even ritual, just accommodation. They knew which rooms required 2 candles instead of 1, which staircases should be taken slowly, which hallways you should never stop walking halfway through. They passed it down not in rules, but in habits. A daughter would watch her mother avoid certain tiles. A boy would notice how the steward never walked near the southern curtain wall after dusk. It wasn't spoken, it was absorbed. And for guests like you, those gaps in routine became very noticeable, very fast. You'd ask why the fire was always kept to one side of the room instead of centered in the hearth. Why the chairs faced away from the long window. Why one of the mirrors near the great chamber had been turned to face the wall. No one would explain. They'd shrug. Old house, they'd say. It remembers itself. And you'd feel that. There were places where the ceiling curved a little lower than necessary. Not enough to brush your head. Just enough to make you feel like you were meant to duck. Like something else passed through often, and the builders knew it. Even the ceilings mattered. Vaulted, timbered, or coffered, they held the weight of centuries. And the older the ceiling, the more it seemed to listen back. You'd look up and forget what you were about to say, not because you were afraid, but because the room didn't want the silence broken. The air in castles wasn't heavy. It was expectant, and that expectation could wear on you. By the 3rd hour of the night, your candle would be low, the hallway outside your chamber dim, but you'd still hear the same sound again and again, soft, distant, the hush of fabric against stone. The castle settling, they'd tell you. But it never felt like settling. It felt like rearrangement. Like the walls were realigning themselves. Like your presence had tilted something out of balance, and the place was trying to correct it. You wouldn't sleep easily. Not because of fear, not even discomfort, but because something in the walls didn't recognize you yet. And until it did, it couldn't decide whether to ignore you or include you. And the worst part? In some ways, that was a kind of hospitality. A medieval castle didn't want to frighten you. It wanted to learn you. And once it did, you became part of its rhythm, its echo, its memory. People who stayed too long reported strange dreams for weeks afterward, not of ghosts or violence or mystery, but of corridors. Endless corridors, rooms with no doors, stone that breathed, floors that whispered under footfall, even when no one was moving. So no, you wouldn't survive a night in a medieval castle, because to survive something means to come through unchanged, and no one who truly sleeps there leaves quite the same. By now, your eyes would be adjusting to the dimness, but that doesn't mean you'd be seeing clearly. Candlelight doesn't illuminate, it suggests. It paints corners rather than fills them. It hides more than it reveals, especially in a medieval castle where angles are strange and the architecture never quite mirrors itself. A hallway might curve just slightly, for no practical reason. A room might narrow toward one end, causing your shadow to lengthen unevenly as you walk. And as night deepens, these irregularities begin to feel deliberate. The flicker of flame creates movement where there is none. A hanging cloak might appear to breathe. A beam in the ceiling might seem to shift. You tell yourself it's the candle, the wick, the draft. And most of the time, it is. But the question lingers. What if just once it isn't? There's a psychological weight to being in a structure not built for you. The doors are heavier. The keyholes are oddly placed. The walls echo with a tone you don't expect. Even the floorboards, those few that exist, creak not with use, but with memory. And this is when you start to realize you're not walking through a building. You're walking through layers of decisions. People made choices here hundreds of years ago. They chose which room should have the narrow slit window, which chamber should be closest to the stairwell, which beams should bear the most weight. And those choices are still active, still shaping the way you move. You're navigating someone else's mind, someone long gone, but whose intentions were made solid in stone. That's the part you don't prepare for. There's a term used by some historians, resonant architecture. It refers to structures that not only hold sound, but seem to participate in it. You cough in the hallway, and the sound doesn't just bounce, it reshapes. You speak in a stairwell, and your voice thins out unnaturally. These aren't acoustical anomalies. They're emotional cues. The castle teaches you how to behave in it. And at night, its lessons get stricter. You walk quieter. You open doors more slowly. Not because someone told you to, but because the castle expects it. The very air insists on it. In some chambers, especially upper-level rooms used by former nobles or clergy, you might feel pressure near the center of the space, as though something dense once stood there and never quite left. You try to ignore it. You check the stonework. You press a hand to the floor. Cold, stable, but the presence remains. Medieval castles weren't clean, not by modern standards, but they weren't messy either. They were intentional. Every crack, every draft, every uneven flagstone had a reason. And when you don't know the reason, your brain invents one. That's the danger. Your mind starts filling in the blanks. Why is this one wooden beam scorched while the others are smooth? Why is there straw only on that side of the storage room? Why is the window shutter bolted from the inside, even though no one uses this room anymore? And eventually, you stop asking, because asking means lingering, and lingering means staying longer than you should. Many guests in medieval castles, diplomats, distant relatives, favored merchants, were housed in what was called the neutral wing. These rooms weren't part of the main family corridor. They were slightly removed. Not in the tower, not near the chapel, just out of reach. They were functional, private, and, most importantly, forgettable. A place where someone could stay, rest, and leave without becoming part of the household. But that separation came at a cost. You didn't hear the nighttime footsteps of the servants. You didn't feel the warmth from the kitchen hearth filtering through stone. You didn't sense the rhythm of the castle's breathing. You were alone in a house that didn't yet recognize you, which meant, to the building's rhythm, you were still a visitor, still an unknown, and unknown things must be watched. There's a recorded journal entry from a clerk staying at Dunster Castle in the 1420s. He writes, There is a space above the beams, behind the plaster. I hear a shifting there. Not rats. Not wind. I will not ask. I will leave before it learns my name. He didn't mean it literally, but he also didn't stay another night. And that's the real truth behind the idea that you wouldn't survive a night in a medieval castle. It's not about violence, or ghosts, or discomfort. It's about how quickly the space turns you into something small, something observed, something slightly out of place in a structure that knows itself too well. Because the castle doesn't need to harm you. It only needs to remind you you're temporary. And once that realization settles in, once you understand how long the castle has stood without you, and how little it would change if you vanished tomorrow, sleep becomes impossible. And survival? That depends on what you think survival means. If sight deceives you at night, sound betrays you. In a medieval castle, silence doesn't exist. Not in the way we think of it. Even in the stillest hours, a castle breathes. Wood shifts, metal contracts, stone echoes. And if you're unaccustomed to the language of these sounds, your imagination will fill the silence with meaning. There's the groan of timber overhead, not a warning of collapse, but a slow exhale of a beam settling against iron nails forged centuries ago. There's the distant clatter of something falling in a kitchen you thought was empty, a utensil sliding off a table, a ladle hitting stone. Or maybe it wasn't a utensil, maybe it was a rat. Or maybe it was neither. And then there's the most difficult sound of all, the one that's almost human. A footstep that isn't quite right. Too soft, too slow, too curious. You sit up in your straw-stuffed mattress. You strain your ears. The sound doesn't repeat. Of course it doesn't. That would be too easy. Instead, it waits. Long enough for your pulse to rise. Long enough for you to question if it ever happened at all. And then, when you finally lie back down, it begins again, but slightly closer. This is how castles test you. Not with grand gestures, not with haunting moans or shifting walls, but with precision. A thump where there shouldn't be one. A knock that isn't answered. A door hinge groaning slowly open from a hallway no one uses after dusk. Because in a castle, sounds don't just travel, they linger. And this is where medieval architecture becomes your enemy. These structures weren't designed for comfort. They were designed for strength and intimidation. Walls up to 10 feet thick. Hallways that twist not for design, but for defense. Spiral staircases that turn to favor a right-handed swordsman retreating upward. Every inch of the structure favors the people who live there. You, as a guest or an outsider, are the anomaly. And when night falls, the building reminds you of that. The castle amplifies the sounds you make, but muffles the ones you hear. You step, and the echo betrays your position. But the thing in the hallway? That arrives and whispers. There are stories of noble guests begging to sleep in servant quarters, not because they preferred the straw mats and low ceilings, but because those rooms felt alive. Servants moved through them. Fires stayed lit longer. The clatter of plates and water buckets gave structure to the night. Predictability, comfort. Meanwhile, the upper chambers, the prestigious ones, were often too quiet. So quiet that every anomaly stood out. One baron in the 1300s reportedly spent 3 weeks sleeping in the castle's stable after insisting the high guest room had a stair that echoed more than it should. His steward insisted there were no footsteps. The baron replied, "Then why do I wake when I hear them stop?" Some of the most haunting stories from the period don't describe ghostly encounters or strange creatures. They describe rhythms. A knock repeated at the same hour for 3 nights. A whisper behind the tapestry wall that follows the listener, room to room. The sound of something climbing stairs, but never reaching the top. People didn't fear what made noise. They feared what almost didn't. There's a strange logic to it. In medieval thought, that which made its presence fully known was less dangerous than that which revealed itself only in part. The howl of a wolf. You could prepare for that. The clatter of hooves on stone. You could see who rode in. But the creak of a stair tread with no weight. The door handle gently tapping the wood, though no draft blows through. That was something else. It's not supernatural. Not necessarily. but it is psychological warfare. Medieval castles weren't cursed. They didn't need to be. They were constructed with a precision that required no haunting, because they haunted by design. And when night fell, that design awakened. The iron sconces that twist just slightly like eyes. The vaulted ceilings that echo the smallest cough with cathedral gravity. The doors that close not with a slam, but with a whisper. That whisper always sounds like it's coming from just behind you. And after hours of this, after the creaks, the soft taps, the subtle shifting, you stop caring what's real. You begin to wish for something to actually happen. A person, a confrontation, anything tangible, but nothing comes. Just the sound of your own heartbeat in a room too old to be impressed by it. And in that moment, the castle wins. Because it has shown you what power truly is. Not brute force, but indifference. The kind that lets you exhaust yourself trying to understand a space that does not care if you re-there. It has stood longer than your memory, and it will outlast your fear. At first, the solitude is impressive. Your chamber is large. Too large. Tapestries flutter slightly in a breeze you can't place. A fireplace wide enough to roast a boar crackles just for you. The bed looks fit for royalty, wood carved into snarling beasts, covers heavy with embroidery, a pillow so thick it feels like sinking into an oath. But as the door closes behind your last visitor, the scale begins to shift. This room wasn't made for a person. It was made for a presence. The flickering torchlight doesn't illuminate. It carves shadows into stone. Each groove in the wall, each fold of the curtain, each carved figure in the woodwork becomes a potential watcher. You know they're not alive. Of course they're not. But they stare anyway. Not with eyes, but with placement, with direction, with the implied posture of something that used to know attention. You try to settle. You tell yourself it's just architecture, history, a grand space designed to impress. But the longer you sit, the clearer it becomes. It wasn't designed to impress you. It was designed for someone else. Someone taller, louder, more commanding. Someone for whom this chamber bent its very frame. You are merely occupying it. And that's when the loneliness begins to deepen. In modern life, loneliness feels like absence. In a medieval castle, it feels like the room remembers someone else and is waiting for them to return. You begin to notice things. Not sounds this time, but expectations. The mirror facing the bed. Who was it meant to reflect? The iron ring on the far wall, rusted and used, but once gripped. The corner where soot gathers despite no fire ever being lit there. You wonder, irrationally, if you should be doing something, saying something. If your stillness itself is an error in this choreography you never learned. And then the floorboards shift. Just one. A casual creak. You weren't walking. Nothing fell. It's just wood, settling. Of course. You try not to check it again. But your ears betray you. Your breath quickens, listening for the next one. There isn't one. That's worse. Because silence now feels like reprimand. You cross the room. You adjust the curtain. You tap the wall. You open the chamber door and listen down the hall, knowing no one will be there. The torches out there are lower, flickering slower. You close the door again, just to feel the click of a decision. The fire crackles. And then, without warning, the loneliness presses against you. It's no longer just in your head. It's spatial, a pressure, as if the walls aren't keeping the cold out, but slowly closing inward. Not enough to trap, just enough to remind you that this space was carved from stone, not built around people. You sit on the bed. You don't lie down. You begin to wonder if anyone can hear you. If you were to speak, would the sound even carry beyond these thick walls? Could anyone tell if you screamed? Of course, you won't scream. That would be absurd. But the thought does come. And that's the thing about medieval castles, especially at night. They do'n't terrify you with ghosts. They unmake you with silence. With removal. They remind you how quickly confidence vanishes when you are alone with nothing but ancient choices. You start to resent the space. The bed is too big. The door too heavy. The hearth too dramatic. It feels theatrical, but there's no audience. No one watching but the room itself. And the room is tired of watching people try to matter. It has seen kings, soldiers, executions, births, sieges, oaths, betrayals. You? You're a night guest with anxious hands and a heartbeat too loud. You stare at the wall. The same tapestry from earlier. A woven hunt scene. You hadn't noticed the eyes before. Every animal on it looks straight ahead. You blink. Convince yourself it's coincidence. But you look away anyway. Eventually, sleep does come, but not gently. It drags you down like cold water, heavy and reluctant. Not because the bed is uncomfortable, but because trusting the space feels wrong. Because no part of this chamber ever told you that rest would be safe. And when you finally do drift off, you're not afraid of what will happen. You're afraid of what the room might remember about you. By this point in the night, you've accepted a few things. You're not sleeping. You're not entirely calm. And whatever part of your brain was trained to reason, to stay rational, that part is tired now. Not scared, not panicked, just misfiring. Because inside this castle, your instincts have no playbook. You thought stone walls would feel safe, but they don't. They echo strangely, carrying your footsteps back to you with a slight delay. Not enough to be obvious, but enough that every sound becomes a question. Was that me? Or did something else move? You try to find patterns. Anchor yourself with familiar concepts. This is just an old building, you tell yourself. People lived in castles all the time. But the deeper truth is, you've never lived without insulation from the world. And a medieval castle doesn't insulate you. It introduces you to everything you forgot existed. The temperature doesn't just shift. It descends. Slowly, but relentlessly. The hearth fire can't warm the air more than 5 feet from its source. Beyond that, the cold winds. You notice it in your jaw, your wrists, your fingertips. And the shadows don't stay still anymore. Because torchlight doesn't behave like light bulbs. It dances. It warps objects. A robe hanging on the wall becomes a hunched figure each time you glance too fast. A chair's silhouette stretches and shortens with each flicker of flame. Eventually, your eyes stop trusting what they see. The room remains the same, but your understanding of it begins to mutate. And that's when the fear creeps in, not from threat, but from disorientation. Because this isn't how your brain expects night to work. There's no hum of distant traffic, no refrigerator cycling, no warm buzz from screens or devices. You can't check the time. There's no phone to tell you someone else is awake out there. You're not just alone. You've been erased from the network of your world. And in the vacuum of that silence, your mind does what human minds always do. It fills in the blanks. That tiny knock, just timber contracting. That dry rasp against stone, maybe a mouse. That faint thud upstairs, probably a shifting beam or a servant, if they're even up. The problem is, there's no one to confirm or deny anything. And that is a dangerous place to be. Because your brain will start inventing explanations just to stop the questions. And once that process starts, it's hard to pull back. You begin to anthropomorphize the space. Not just imagine things in it, but assign intentions to inanimate structures. That alcove isn't just dark, it's waiting for you to look. That iron ring in the wall isn't just rusted, it's expectant. That old carved face on the wardrobe, it's not just a motif, it's watching to see what you'll do next. You feel your heartbeat in your fingertips now. You've rubbed your palms together 20 times in the last hour. You've checked the fire even though you don't need to. And somewhere in the quiet, you started whispering to yourself. Not in fear, in maintenance. Because silence in a castle gets too thick. It's not like home silence. It's layered. It has memory. It feels like it's holding its breath, just long enough to hear what you'll do next. You try sitting again. You try pacing. You count the seconds between creaks in the ceiling. You recite things you remember, school lessons, old lyrics, anything, but it all feels out of place here. Like each syllable is echoing into a space that resents modern thought. You suddenly understand something about medieval people, not just their fears, but their rituals. The chants, the prayers, the knocking 3 times before entering. They weren't silly gestures. They were anchors. tools to keep their minds from wandering too far in the dark. You don't have those tools. You have logic, and it's starting to dissolve. Because you can't logic your way out of cold stone, or guess the hour by moonlight when no windows face east, or explain why that one door downstairs creaked 5 times, then stopped. Eventually, you doze. Not deeply, not restfully, but out of cognitive exhaustion. And in that half sleep, your dreams aren't nightmares. They're reconstructions. Your brain, desperately trying to rebuild familiar places. Offices, apartments, cafes, just so you have something solid to stand in. But each time you wake up, you're back in the castle. Stone, cold, still, watching. Because surviving a medieval night wasn't just about safety. It was about keeping your own mind in one piece. And that was far harder than anyone admits. By the time the castle courtyard had settled into its final stillness, after the torches were dimmed and the gates locked from within, what followed wasn't silence. It was something more complicated. It was an environment shaped by the unique acoustics of stone, wood, wind, and breath. You might think that once the noise of feet, carts, servants, and shouting had died down, the night would finally be quiet. But the medieval castle, even asleep, had a soundscape that could unsettle anyone not born into it. Start with the walls themselves. Thick, solid stone, yes, but porous in their own way. They echoed. They retained sound. A sneeze in the lower chamber might find its way faintly into a gallery upstairs through corridors and stairwells that twisted like acoustic tunnels. Many first-time visitors to large castles remarked how easily one could hear whispers in places where no one stood. Then there were the creaks, not of modern wood expanding with temperature, but of aged beams under stress from centuries of use. Rafters groaned under their own weight. Doors shifted, even locked ones, as wind pulled at uneven hinges. Metal fittings, latches, chains, sconces would click or shift without warning. These weren't ominous sounds to residents, but to an outsider, they were unnerving, especially if you didn't yet know what they meant. Medieval stone kept cold. As the temperature dropped, air moved. Drafts snuck under doorways and through arrow slits, and where they moved, they brought sound. A tapestry shifting in wind could sound like a foot dragging. A small rustle might carry through a hallway like a cloak brushing a wall. And then there were the animals. Even the best-guarded castles had rats, mice, insects, bats in the rafters. Cats were welcome residents for this very reason, though their presence sometimes introduced its own kind of night noise, scuffles, yowls, the soft thud of a leap from a beam. Horses shifted in the stables, goats bleated if disturbed, and watchdogs occasionally barked at things no one else could see. One noblewoman staying as a guest in a Scottish keep in 1392 recorded in her travel diary that she was awakened 6 times in the dark by a single sound. Never the same twice, but none which I could place. And the people, well, they snored, muttered in sleep, shifted on straw mattresses that rustled like dry leaves. Chamber pots were used at all hours. Floors were uneven. Footsteps were never completely silent. If someone rose in the night, you might hear them 5 minutes before they reached your room. Now consider the mental toll of this soundscape. A guest unfamiliar with the rhythm might lie awake, mind cataloging each thump, rattle, and breath, interpreting them one by one. Was that the wind? Was someone walking? Was the latch shifting on its own, or being tested? There was no modern insulation, no hum of electricity to blur background noise. Every sound was distinct. Every one carried weight. In some cases, this sound awareness was deliberate. Guards and stewards relied on it. They listened for unfamiliar steps, or the absence of familiar ones. A hallway that was too quiet might mean someone was missing. A dog not barking when it usually did could indicate trouble. Castles trained their inhabitants to notice patterns in noise. And deviations from those patterns weren't ignored. They were often investigated immediately. This explains why most guests didn't sleep well during their first nights in castles. Even the privileged found it difficult. Travel logs from nobles and church officials are filled with mentions of unrestful nights, too much echo, or walls that whispered. A visiting Italian monk wrote that the night in an English fortress spoke back to him through every board and lock. Some castles tried to mitigate the psychological strain. Tapestries weren't just decorative, they absorbed sound. Rushes were spread on floors not only for cleanliness, but for noise dampening. In wealthier residences, chamber doors were double barred, not only for security, but to limit how much sound entered or exited a room. Yet even in the best of conditions, there was no such thing as silence. There was always something moving, something creaking, something breathing. And perhaps that's what made a medieval night so exhausting for the unprepared. Not because of what was heard, but because of what might be heard next. Spending a night in a medieval castle wasn't the romantic experience we often imagine. Behind the grandeur of stone walls and torchlit halls lay a very different kind of reality, one defined by discomfort, unfamiliar rhythms, and the ever-present awareness of being watched by the dark. The beds were hard, the cold was biting, the silence was never truly silent, and even the smallest sounds could feel magnified in those long, sleepless hours. But more than anything, what made medieval nights so difficult was that they weren't designed for guests. They were designed for survival. Every rule, every custom, every odd architectural choice had a purpose: to keep danger out, routine in, and to make sure that anything unusual didn't go unnoticed. Modern comfort softens us to the slow and heavy pace of the past. But in a medieval castle, the night wasn't downtime. It was a test. A test of your nerves, your instincts, and your ability to function in an environment that never really slept. So, would you survive a night in a medieval castle? Maybe, but you wouldn't rest. And you certainly wouldn't forget it.